We're at the second half of our experience this morning. So we're going to answer a few questions which people have posed, and I really hope we get to everyone's ideas that they wanted to be talked about. So one of the things is, one of the things I want to tell people is that all the talks that we're doing today are being videotaped. The videographer's in the back of the room. Thanks. And they'll be uploaded onto our YouTube site probably in a couple of months. It takes a while to edit them, but it varies how often. But it'll get up there. When they're up there, we'll say on our Twitter feed and Facebook page that they're up there, so you'll know. And also the slides will be available on the website? Yes. On the website. So for those who've been writing things down furiously, there'll be other opportunities, including an opportunity to maybe see slides that people ran out of time to speak about. So I wanted to mention that. And because we're videotaping it, this is the only microphone that we know will be heard well on the videotape. So we have to use this. So when we have the speakers answer questions, they'll have to come up here and do that. And if they don't want to, I'm going to answer in your name and say whatever I think you would have said. And if you don't trust me, you better do it yourself. So first, I don't know if people listen to Wait, Don't Tell Me. So this is like, I'll start with, lightning fill in the blanks, short answer questions. So these are some questions that, I'll just answer very briefly. They're all great questions, and these are ones we can give yes or no or brief answers to. So one question is, have there been any studies related to early onset Alzheimer's, which is defined variously as Alzheimer's before age 65, or some people will use 70. The answer is yes. There are a few centers that do it, and we're one of them. We have, in fact, a project that started over the last year that's being led by Gil Rabinovich, and we're welcoming patients with that kind of problem to understand the genetics of it, the reasons why it's happening so young, how to follow people over time, etc. So the answer is yes, and all you have to do is contact us in any way that you know how, to ask us about how to get involved or involve somebody you know, if that's the goal. Another person says that they have dyslexia, and they're wondering about studies that relate to dyslexia and aging. Again, we chose this one because, in fact, we're involved in that too. We have some data that's emerged over the last couple of years, mostly led by Zach Miller, who's here on the side, and with Mary Lou Gorner-Tempini, who's the leader of our language program, that suggests that dyslexia may put people at subtle risk for a little more chance of certain kinds of symptoms if you're developing Alzheimer's. It may influence what kinds of symptoms you get and who gets them. And that may not be limited to dyslexia. It may be for any other developmental uniqueness that certain people have. And so we're very interested in that kind of question. And to do that, we want to be able to study people who had dyslexia or other developmental challenges at some point when they were younger, who are not suffering from cognitive trouble, as well as those who are. And so again, we have an active program for that. If that's an interest of yours, just get in touch with us saying you're interested, and we'll connect you to the right person. Does CMS, the Center for Medicare Services, cover imaging for potential memory care diagnoses? I'll cut to the chase that I assume the person's asking understandably about amyloid imaging. And so the answer is, right now they've made an interim decision that they won't cover it, but that's going to change, we hope, very soon. And the reason is that CMS, I think, is still trying to figure out how physicians would use amyloid imaging, where it will be helpful, where it might be misused. And so what they want is, if they're going to fund amyloid imaging for a potential diagnosis of Alzheimer's, that it's done in a way that would allow us to understand how it's being used and to make sure it's being used to good effect. And so they're actually talking with Gil again, very actively, and it's far along in the planning stages, to fund a very large study that would involve many centers around the country, so that they would indeed pay for amyloid imaging in the context of collecting data about how it's being used. And that, we hope, is something that will start in, within the year. So the answer is no right now, but I think it'll be changing very soon. And I think it's a very big study. I don't anticipate it would be that hard for many people to get amyloid imaging through a study like that, because it's not as if it'll have very limited enrollment. Will today's talks and slides be posted on the website? Yes. We already said that. What is the difference between Alzheimer's disease and dementia? This is a great question, and it comes up many times. And one of the reasons it's a great question is because we don't always communicate in the clearest way about what the answer is. So the word dementia, I always say, isn't really a full diagnosis. All the term dementia means is that somebody's having memory or behavioral or thinking problems, other kinds of thinking problems besides memory, that have developed slowly over time, gotten worse over time, and are now at the point that they're affecting your everyday activities so that you can't perform them in the way that you could in the past. The reason that threshold is really important is because as neurologists and geriatricians, and we recognize that some change in thinking is probably okay with normal aging, but a certain amount of change is not acceptable. And that term dementia is clearly over the line. It means there must be a process that's bothering your brain that needs to be diagnosed. A lot of the work we talk about is trying to move the diagnosis earlier so that we don't use that term dementia. That's not the only time we're making the diagnosis and treatment. And we're in the phase of changing that. But that's what the word dementia means. Once someone makes a diagnosis of dementia, it means you think there's a problem, there must be a cause, then we have to make a diagnosis. The most common cause, probably, of dementia is Alzheimer's disease, which is when those plaques and tangles with the amyloid and the tau are building up in your brain, and eventually, after many years of that happening, it causes dementia. So that's the difference between Alzheimer's and dementia. And there are many other causes many other causes like frontotemporal dementia and other things where the term dementia applies equally well, but it's not caused by Alzheimer's disease. What is progressive supranuclear palsy? So there's really a lot in this question about where it comes from, and it's probably too much to go into all the details. Very briefly, it's a disorder that used to be considered as an unusual form of Parkinson's. The patients with progressive supranuclear palsy develop symptoms of stiffness and falling and difficulty with movement and tremor that looks a lot like Parkinson's, especially to the untrained eye. Neurologists can differentiate it. And on the other hand, those patients with PSP, progressive supranuclear palsy, don't respond as well to the usual Alzheimer's medicines. The usual anti-Parkinson's medicines. And the reason we talk about it so much is because it turns out that under the microscope, Parkinson's is caused by another protein called alpha-synuclein that isn't closely related to frontotemporal degeneration, which is one of the things we study a lot. But progressive supranuclear PSP is caused by the tau protein. So it's really come to be recognized that it's part of the family of frontotemporal degenerations, and that's why we talk about it so much, because we end up seeing it quite a bit. So that's PSP. And it affects, for those interested in anatomy and physiology, I'll say the major effects are in the brainstem and the basal ganglia parts of the brain. And that's why it causes these physical symptoms. What is the healthy volunteer process? Joel, when you come up and answer some more questions, I'll ask you to describe that briefly. Similar question of Alzheimer's versus aphasia. So dementia I just described, it's just a syndrome describing the problem. Aphasia is another descriptive term that says that this person is having worsening trouble with their language over time, with expressing themselves or understanding other people or both, and that they didn't have it as a child. It's developed with adulthood, late in life, and it's getting slowly and slowly worse over time. That's called a progressive aphasia. The most common cause of aphasia is stroke, probably, but we don't see that here. What we see is progressive aphasia. So that's yet another term that doesn't really explain the cause. It just describes the symptom, and then you have to think about a cause. So when you have a progressive aphasia, one potential cause is Alzheimer's disease. Instead of affecting mostly the memory systems of the brain, some patients have prominent effects of accumulation of those plaques and tangles in the parts of the brain on the left hemisphere that have to do with language. And that's an unusual presentation of Alzheimer's disease, but we see it fairly frequently. It's a little more common in the younger onset variety of Alzheimer's, which I'm only pointing that out because somebody asked about it. There are other causes of progressive aphasia, and the other causes are the frontotemporal degeneration. So the protein tau that we talked about, when it accumulates selectively in the left hemisphere, it can cause language symptoms that we would call primary progressive aphasia. And the other protein, TDP43, which accounts for the other half of frontotemporal degeneration, roughly, it also, if it accumulates on the left side more than the right, can result in an aphasia syndrome as one of the earliest symptoms. Okay, there's another question I hear about memory to improve memory loss, and Adam's got a few questions on therapy, so I'll leave that for him. What is PSP and CBS? CBS is corticobasal syndrome. It's also a tauopathy. It also used to be considered an atypical form of Parkinsonism, and now it's become part of our spectrum for the same reasons I described with PSP. The symptoms are a little different, and I'll leave it at that. Are we working with the VA, and how about Kaiser? So we are working with the VA, and we have been ever since we've been here. And in fact, we're a state Alzheimer's center. That's one of our funding sources is the state of California. And as a state center, we share that funding with VA. The leader of that program, she leads the Memory Disorders Clinic, is Christine Yaffe, who has very prominent special interests in the risk factors that relate to dementia, and she studied them in many large trials. And she's a very close colleague. And Cindy Barton really works on both sides, works on our end at the Memory and Aging Center part of our program, as well as at the VA 2 days a week? 1 day a week now. And really runs the follow-up portion of that clinic and is very involved in the new patient assessments too. What about Kaiser? So we actually have a very special program with Kaiser. Over many years, we've talked with Kaiser about working with them to try to, they help us and we help them understand these issues better. And we have this program now where through the Kaiser San Francisco is how it started, they can refer patients directly into our research program rather than going through the rigmarole of getting Kaiser to approve an outside referral. And what's good about that, it's sort of a win for everybody. The physicians in Kaiser, they're happy for us to consult, and they don't have to argue with the administration that this is a valid consultation. So what they do is they send us patients that they think would be of interest to us and that we might be able to help them understand and that would fit the criteria for our research. Robin usually is the one who reviews the data, and we have one particularly close nurse, Marilyn Williams, who works with us on the Kaiser end. They actually sign a consent form at Kaiser saying they know they're coming for research, and then they participate in research. Some of you may have come through that route. I know there are probably about close to 100 people in our center who've done that now. And then we send a note back to Kaiser, really for our colleagues, the physicians and nurses, to say, yes, this is what we thought. You were right about the diagnosis in our opinion or not, and this is what we recommend for further evaluation. And then we keep following them, assuming they are indeed great to be in our research, which has almost always been true. So that's the Kaiser program. And the relationship, I hope, will allow us to build a lot more things with Kaiser. This is a great center where we can understand how dementia is being diagnosed, how it's being managed, and they really have a very kind of a broad sampling of people that live in the Bay Area. So, okay, a couple of questions. I'll leave these for Bruce, and I think I'm done with the short answers. Okay. So, and even though I know they weren't that short all the time, but so short answers for him. Yeah. Thank you. You're welcome. Yeah. So maybe we'll start. I happen to have a couple for Bruce in my hand. So, Bruce, would you mind coming up and just taking a couple?
So this question is about cannabinoids in marijuana. Why I'm being asked, I really have no idea. Can they be a benefit in PSP? Never been studied, I believe, Adam. Is that true? But anyone who has personal experiences, we're interested. I think we don't have all the answers about things that there's someone who has personal experience. Oh, you can't hear? Okay. I'm not sure you want to hear, actually. No. So the question is, do cannabinoids help in PSP? Or I guess, and do they help in Alzheimer's or other disorders? I don't even have anecdotal reports from people. We had a really nice talk recently at the Memory and Aging Center by, I think it was Dr. Abrams. And he talked about the areas where there's some good evidence for cannabinoids. And certainly with chemotherapy and cancer, there have some benefit, probably chronic pain. So our diseases, don't fall into those two categories. But honestly, it's never been studied. What, if any, correlation do concussions in early life lead to FTD or AD? Yeah, it's a great question. And I think not clear we have a good answer about that. We work with the National Football League, and I'm struck by how many of the players say to me that they think that the worst damage they suffered was in Pee Wee League. So I think we take this seriously. And I think one of the things I've been struck by in the last year is that we've really underestimated the role of head injury in all of the diseases that we study. I think the football players really focused us around tau in particular, and the chronic traumatic encephalopathy that has been described now in almost 100 players who have retired from the NFL comes, we are almost certain, from repetitive head trauma. Christine Yaffe, one of our collaborators with Raquel Gardner, has done work at the Yountville VA. And it's pretty clear that when they're looking prospectively at a population of people in the Veterans Hospital who have had a history of head trauma over 9 years, those who have had head trauma versus those who have not have had marked increased risks for developing dementia. We think it may be that the risk for dementia depends on your own biology and maybe the type of head trauma that you had. Perhaps some people, the head trauma is a risk for Alzheimer's. Others, perhaps a risk for a type of frontotemporal dementia. David Perry from our group did a study, and even Parkinson's disease looks like that previous head trauma may be a risk. So we think head trauma is very serious. I fought my own battles in my own household around this, and I banned the household from headers in soccer. This caused great hostility last time I said this. And also horseback riding. So I think recently saw someone who had head trauma from horseback riding, and not trivial. I mean, I think we have to protect our kids and our grandkids from later life problems. So thanks.
So Dr. Levenson, there were a couple of questions for you, if you'd like to come up. I think they're pretty easy to read. That's about a gender effect.
So the first question is, are there gender differences among caregivers in how they handle negative effects of being a caregiver? Great question, and we don't know the answer to that yet. It's definitely going to be an important question. We do know that in healthy couples, especially this generation that's coming into their 50s, 60s, 70s now, that they're there are some very interesting gender differences. So for example, in this generation, we found in our work that helping men to sort of down-regulate their emotions is not as important as helping women. So in our normal work, we find that couples who can keep wives sort of emotionally calm do much better in life. So just a little tidbit, it's not the question, but we just published that work. It's based on a 20-year longitudinal study we did of a group of Bay Area marriages. So we're going to definitely focus on these gender differences. My guess is that probably the disease is so powerful that it dwarfs a lot of the gender differences. But we'll hopefully, if I'm invited back next year, we'll know the answer to that. Oh, this is about the skimmed part, the part that I didn't get to. So we're always doing this research that's very physiological, and those of you who have been in the lab know that we wire people up and we make videotapes, and they take years to analyze before we know the answers. I have a new graduate student who used a very, very simple test, and you can do it yourself if you haven't been over in our lab. You basically draw two circles. One's you, and one's the person you're either caring for or your partner in your relationship. And you sort of say, how close are they together? How much of the other person has become a part of you? It's a very simple test. And you can have them, like really far away, or they could be right over each other. So it turns out that in caregivers, the further away that they draw those circles from the person they're caring for, the sicker the caregiver gets. In other words, it seems like one of the things that's really difficult is that sense of disconnection and distance. We are a very social species, and we know that one of the most powerful predictors of well-being in late life, are how socially connected we are. Our social ties are really the royal road to health and well-being. And if you have a disease that kind of increases that distance, it can be particularly hard on the caregiver. So that was the other finding I was going to share. And that's something very low tech, it just comes from a paper and pencil questionnaire, and you can think about it in your own life, in terms of ways of staying connected to the people around you.
Robin needs no introduction. She's probably the person in our center who you all know the most, maybe except for Dr. Miller. But Robin is our nurse who really runs two of the main research programs and interacts with so many of you when you have questions about how to handle lots of problems. So, and she's going to answer a couple of questions.
Yeah. Okay, so this one might also be something that Dr. Levenson could comment on, but I'm going to read it the way I interpreted it. Is caregiver impact exclusive to dementia caregivers? So I think that a lot of the knowledge and science that we have about caregiving springs from research on not just dementia caregivers, but caregivers who have grappled with diseases like cancer, HIV, long-term chronic health conditions. So there is a lot of research and literature out there about caregiving as an experience, regardless of the illness that you're dealing with. And then underneath that, there is a lot of research on dementia caregivers. We learned from the research on other caregiving experiences. A really practical example of that right now is Jennifer Merrilees is leading an intervention project to help caregivers deal with the stresses in their lives, using some techniques based on mindfulness-based stress reduction and other kinds of practices. But the origin of that research was in different kinds of caregivers. People, I believe, with cancer, Jennifer can correct me if I'm wrong, and I know for sure in the HIV population. So I'm not sure if that was exactly how the question was meant, but that's how I interpreted it. So I hope that's okay. And then this is a favorite question of ours. The nurses work on this a lot. How do you get into the frame of reference of an Alzheimer patient? Understand where they are. This is actually the key, I think, to being able to manage living with these illnesses, is to get into that perspective, and it's a very, very difficult thing to do. We in our clinic, and we have a special clinic that the nurses run where we try to help caregivers with just this issue, trying to reinvent the world in a way so that it's easier to understand how people with Alzheimer's disease are perceiving language, perceiving their experiences, the visual world, understanding the world without the benefit of good memory. And the same with other diseases that we deal with, just trying to understand how the world must seem to that person and how we can change the environment around them and the way we approach them to make their lives easier, calmer, and I think in that way, life is easier and calmer for everybody in the home. So it's not a question that we can answer in a simple few sentences. I think it's a process, and I think it's part of the process is being in these rooms and listening and hearing about these diseases and conditions and getting as much information as there is out there, participating in our programs, both research and clinic, where we can work with the caregivers to really try to understand these illnesses better. I think we all, as a group, are really interested in this, and we really want to understand it. I don't think we'd spend all the time that we do thinking about emotions and behaviors without really trying to understand what that patient experience is like. So I think we're all working on this together, and we want to be able to help everybody try to understand it. So, yeah.
A couple of sleep-related questions, Christine?
Did we explain why we're having to do this?
Yeah.
Oh,
It's the video.
okay.
So the first question is, in the sleep studies, does the equipment attached to the subject interfere with sleep? Great question. I would have expected yes, and some of our subjects certainly do find it a little bit more cumbersome, but I've never had a problem with it, and most of our subjects have no complaints. They actually sometimes find it's easier to sleep with the equipment on. I don't understand that one. As you can see in our data, everybody was wearing the sleep equipment when they napped during the day, so it can't be too disruptive. This is a question asking about sleep apnea and sleep disturbance towards cognition and disease. It's a really great question. I think with sleep apnea, certainly, what's happening when you are going through an apneic period is your oxygen is not going to your brain, so you're not breathing. And so if we think about the talks we heard earlier about trying to think about brain health, stopping oxygen to your brain, it's always going to potentially cause detrimental effects. So highly recommend CPAP. If CPAP's not working for you, there's a number of other treatments as well. And there are a number of studies that show that both sleep apnea and sleep disturbance do affect your cognition detrimentally, and it may not be immediate, although you'll tend to be sleepier during the day, and so that's going to cause some cognition difficulties. But certainly years down the road, we do see some sleep disturbance-related cognition. In our studies, in our healthy older adults, we certainly see day-to-day variability in sleep, and those that are having less steady sleep patterns. We do see some cognitive decline or just cognitive impairment that isn't present in those that are sleeping well or have steady sleep disturbance.
So I always like to point out, I think what Christine said is exactly right. she knows quite a bit about sleep. But I do want to point out that as far as we know, disorders like sleep apnea don't cause dementia, except in very rare circumstances where somebody's so affected by it that they can't get through life. But it's not a major component of development of Alzheimer's as far as we know right now, or other diseases like it. And there's also chicken and egg issues. Once you start developing problems, we're not always sure how to decide what's causing what. So, but there's no question that it makes a contribution to cognitive trouble that could be quite significant. Next set of questions, I thought, for Adam. So there are, needless to say, understand a lot of questions about clinical trials. So we just asked Adam to go through a few and choose some that he thought were representative. So, thanks. Do you have Adam?
Yeah. Well, so I think there were a number of questions about the recent news about this antibody that Biogen has announced a few days ago called, I think it's called aducanumab. I may have pronounced it incorrectly. This is one of the anti-amyloid antibodies. It's newer than the other ones that have been tested before. And it was in the first stage of testing in a relatively small number of people. And the Biogen people saw some potentially encouraging results. I think from my perspective, this is, if we're using baseball analogies, this might be between a single and a double. It's not a home run. There's not even a triple. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. And I think when we hear about results like this, we have to remember that particularly when they're coming out of the pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of money to be made. And so it's not just, the science is exciting. Definitely, we hope it works, and this might be the best antibody out there, but this was just the first stage of testing. There are 2 more stages it needs to go through with thousands of people before we're sure that it really works, and it's going to take at least a few years for that to happen. So part of the reason why this got so much press was also for business reasons, I would think, as well.
So this one I remember seeing.
Yeah, this is it. Yep.
Okay.
So why participate in a solanezumab study or another amyloid study if tau is the real culprit? So that's a great question. We think that eventually tau may be more of a culprit, but what's really driving it, at least in Alzheimer's disease, this tau problem may be the amyloid that's sitting around in people's brains for 10 or 20 years. So even though the amyloid isn't the direct cause of a lot of the symptoms we think in Alzheimer's disease, if we remove it early enough or prevent it from building up, that might be good enough to prevent the tau problems. So we're really excited about new tau drugs, but we don't have nearly as much experience with them, and we don't know whether they're going to work. We're getting a lot of hints, like this new drug, that the amyloid drugs really can have some sort of effect, and if we can learn how to maximize that, it might really be beneficial.
And you could just, if one looks fast.
Are there side effects of anti-amyloid therapy? So that's another good question. So far, the drugs that we've been testing here have been pretty well tolerated. There is a concern about brain swelling that some of the early anti-amyloid drugs had. And interestingly, this new drug, aducanumab, that Biogen reported also has that problem. And so if we think about all of there's a lot of technical aspects to developing a therapy. Not only does it have to be effective in reducing memory problems, but it also has to be safe. And so that's another reason why I say this is a single or a double and not a home run, because we already see there are some potential safety concerns with the drug.
These might be the ones you saw before if you want.
Do you want to talk about supplements?
Oh, supplements, that was, yeah. So we often get a lot of questions about supplements. Somebody asked about their one, Adium, Alpha Brain, Brain Fire, Brain Abundance, Brainstorm Elite, Sabria. So there's a whole lot of them, and I know I've seen the ads in the Chronicle, and There have been some really well done clinical trials of some of the components in these supplements, like ginkgo biloba, other vitamins, and probably to make a long story very short, none of these supplements have proven to have any efficacy at all. And some of them have things in them that we don't even know what they are. And there's been recent press about how some of the supplements that are even sold at reputable stores like Target and GNC actually are mainly just sawdust. So we do not recommend that people take supplements. You don't know what you're getting. There's no benefit that they help. Yeah, and the FDA, well, the FDA doesn't regulate them in the same way that a drug is regulated. So a lot of the supplements make these claims. Again, you see these ads in the newspaper that, oh, this is a cure for Alzheimer's disease. But because it's not a drug, the FDA doesn't force them to tell the truth. So you can make a lot of claims about a supplement that may have no scientific basis at all. And currently, there's a whole lot of interesting politics behind this. There's no way to prevent a supplement company from making these what may be false claims. So don't believe the hype. There's no evidence for it.
Yeah, thanks. So there's definitely more. Two things I want to say. We recognize that even with our best efforts, we're not going to get to everybody's great questions. And we'll point out that on our website or maybe in other reputable websites like the Alzheimer's Association and Association for FTD, and there are sites for PSP, et cetera. There may be answers to some of your questions. We're sort of talking about the idea of whether we could come up with some kind of frequently asked questions approach so that we can sometimes get some of these answers up. So just so you know, we're going to think more about that. I want to address a couple of questions that came up around diversity, both cultural, ethnic, and financial diversity, so to speak. And I think this is a hugely important question. So somebody made the observation there are really no African Americans in the room, maybe one or two now, but very few. And it took me a while to find that person, and that's the point, right? It's a huge issue that affects this whole field. So I don't know if I'll make it better or worse by saying that I recently looked at the database. There's a big database that we contribute data to called the NAC, the National Alzheimer's Coordinating Center. There are about 35 centers who have contributed data to that database over the last 10 years. There are 38,000 people in that database, and about 3,000 of them are African Americans. Only 700 of them are Asian, and Hispanics, the number's about the same. I think it's kind of in between. So this is not just an issue here, it's a huge issue nationally. And I think all of our centers have been tasked with trying to deal with this and try to reach out. And there are many more factors than I can discuss as to why that is, why we're not being more successful. We recognize this, and I think one of the issues is it takes a lot of concerted effort. If you're going to go to a certain community, you have to make a very big effort to go to that community. It has to be concerted and over many years and over time. For the reasons of the demographics of the Bay Area and the fact that Asian Americans are among the group that's least thought about by even other Alzheimer's centers, we chose to focus on Chinese Americans. And so we make sure we have Chinese American staff and Chinese speakers. And it's resulted in some success in building a small cohort of Chinese Americans that we're trying to build on. But it's not enough. And we recognize that, and we know that everything we find will have its limitations if we don't address this issue. So, all I could really do is acknowledge the issue right now and say that if people have thoughts about how we can improve on this, we are, very happy to get involved. I will say, we do things like go to churches and do talks like that, and we love doing those things, and they have their value. But I'll tell you, and this is the experience of every other center in the country, that those kinds of things don't get people into research by themselves. They're not an efficient way to do that. So so we're happy to do those things, but we know it takes even more than that. And some centers have done a great job, by the way, that have really focused on it. But we have a ways to go. So I'll acknowledge, and I think the same, by the way, is true for financial challenges, and which sometimes go with education. You know, most of the people in our cohort are highly educated. Joel made a joke yesterday that, you mean low education, like less than 15 years? I mean, it's a big issue for us that we don't have enough people with lower education. All of the things we talk about are affected by this issue. So it's not just ethnicity and race, but it's even other issues that are relevant to our society. So we're working on it, and we'd like to work on it more. A couple of questions about genetics. Have we, sorry. All right, let me skip this one, come back to it. Genetic risk factors in early onset dementia. So this is a great question. So I think that's what you would come to believe from the literature is if you get Alzheimer's, for instance, at an age lower than typical, like below age 65, that the chances are pretty strong that it's related to a gene. So as Suzee pointed out, there are different kinds of genes, and one of those genes is ApoE4, which increases the risk, but is far from a guarantee that you'll get Alzheimer's. And so if you get Alzheimer's under age 65, there is a higher chance that you having an ApoE4 allele may have contributed to that. But one of the big outcomes of talking about genetics is, well, how does this affect my children and things like that? And an ApoE4 is an example of something where it's not so clear how it affects your children, and you don't want to kind of infer all that baggage from just ApoE4. There are other kinds of genes which have a much stronger effect and make people think about these issues much more strongly. In FTD, those genes probably account for 20-ish% of FTD. Bruce, I'm looking to see. I've seen various numbers, and I think that's kind of what we've settled on for now. In Alzheimer's, it's a very small number, probably like 2%. And so even of the young onset, it's maybe 10%. So I wanted to address a few of those things. And the last, I know we're going to stretch a few minutes over. There were some questions for Kate and Joel that I wanted to make sure we get to, and then we'll wrap it up. Come on up, Kate.
I got some good questions about eligibility for the care ecosystem I wanted to address. Is the care ecosystem available to patients in Missouri? Right now, it's available to patients living in California, Nebraska, and Iowa. But we hope if the study is successful, it'll be available nationally. Would a Kaiser Medicare patient be eligible? You can have any type of private insurance, that's fine. You just also need to have Medicare or Medicaid or be applying for these services. And that's because the study is funded by CMS. Can you be in the program if the patient is in a nursing home? You can't be in a nursing home at the time of study entry. You can be in assisted living but not a nursing home. But if you go into a nursing home, we'll stay with you. And lastly, what happened to the Dementia Watch that you talked about last year? There actually is going to be a Dementia Watch as part of the care ecosystem. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I'll be here. Come talk to me afterwards. Thank you.
And thanks, Kate. And the runner-up, I wanted to bring Joel to wrap it up for us. Has a few questions about aging and lifestyle factors, right? You can talk about that too? Yeah, exercise.
All right, real quick. I'll be really fast. So first question, how does the normal control program work? I've wondered about that myself. Basically, here's how it's organized. There's a central hub we're so grateful to the Hillbloom Foundation for funding a Hillbloom Aging Network. This central hub is responsible for recruiting and just doing a general screening, getting people in, talking to a study partner, doing a quick cognitive screen, a quick neuro exam, just to establish that they are looking fairly healthy. At that particular point, there are so many studies at the Memory and Aging Center that we try and funnel these particular subjects to. I mean, it could be treatment trials, it could be sleep studies, studies that are interested in using MRI to look at brain structure. There are studies that are trying to learn more about the molecular basis of cognitive change. We're looking at proteins in the brain, so we schedule these PET scans for amyloid, PET scans for tau, getting blood for inflammatory factors, DNA, different aspects of cognition. And then I want to just give a quick shout out to Matt Wynn, who's in the back of the room, who's one of the primary central coordinators of the cognitive aging program. So again, there's a central hub and then so many other programs that are really interested in figuring out how we can maintain optimal brain functioning as we age. That's sort of the common goal that unites all of these particular studies. Now, related to this are several questions that have to do with exercise. Please discuss exercise as it applies to reducing dementia. So again, thinking big picture here, I think there are three major factors that influence how our brains change with age. There's genetics, there's early environmental exposures like education and Pop Warner football, and then there's lifestyle. And I think lifestyle is particularly important for us to study because we actually have some control over that. Exercise is certainly a component of lifestyle. How might exercise have any impact on brain structure and functioning? Well, there are really a few different possible ways. The first is the fact that if you are exercising regularly, it's good for your heart. It's lowering your body mass index. It's improving your cholesterol. It's improving your heart rate. So anything that's good for the heart is good for the brain, because we know that one of the key things that influences how our brains change and how brain function changes is how much cerebrovascular disease there is in the brain. And in fact, the presence of cerebral vascular disease may be one of the reasons, or let me reverse that. The absence of cerebral vascular disease in the brain might be one of the reasons why older folks who have amyloid in their heads are still doing fairly well. So again, the impact of exercise on heart function and cardiovascular is one area. The second aspect that exercise might influence is inflammation. Even though it hurts after you exercise, we note that people who exercise have lower levels of inflammatory proteins and chemicals in their brain. We think, and we have a whole study looking at this, that there's an association between inflammation and amyloid, and we're not quite sure in what direction there's causality, possibly both. But again, that's one of the areas that we're studying. And a third thing is that exercise is known to be associated with a hormone called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And this particular neurotrophic factor is associated with our ability to form new brain cells, new neurons. And it's particularly important for the development of new brain cells in the hippocampus. Hippocampus is part of the brain that's so important for memory. And you know, there have been some trials done by colleagues throughout the country that are now really beginning to show us that if you place older, healthy individuals in an exercise program, you can see improvements in memory, you can see improvements in brain structure, and increases in the amount of brain-derived neurotrophic factor in the blood. So exercise is likely. Well, and then the next follow-up question is, well, how much exercise? What kind of exercise? You know, we don't really know that yet. You know, the thinking is that if you can, and what I tell other people, if you're huffing and puffing, that's probably good. It doesn't really matter what kind. What's important is that you enjoy it. How much? Again, it's not entirely clear. You know, we don't want you don't need to run marathons. A brisk walk may be sufficient, but I think that future research is going to help us understand that a little bit better. And again, it all falls back to the sage words of Dr. Nike: just do it.
What about AHA, American Heart Association?
I don't know.
I don't
Okay.
remember. So in the absence of knowing the answer, we're done.
Maybe we will put on our website an answer to the questions in the next week
Okay.
that haven't been answered.
I just like to say, I think this is a very difficult question about exercise and how much, and the answer is we don't really know how much is enough. But I do like to remind people that the American Heart Association has specific guidelines that are reasonable, and at least you could follow them and know you're doing something that many people think is a reasonable amount, which is basically 150 minutes a week of moderate exercise. So the huffing and puffing has to add up to 150 minutes a week, and if you're doing that, they would consider that the right amount. So, but we don't know if less is plenty or more, or that's still not enough. Did you want to wrap that up, Bruce, or say? Well, then I'll say thank you very much again, not only for coming today, but for all the efforts that you've put in to make this and much other work possible. And enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll stay around for those who can. For the faculty, we'll stay, and the staff will stay around for a few minutes if people would like to talk.